Okay, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Local Planner Working Group, Monday, the 16th of January, 2023. In terms of housekeeping, I don't think we're expecting any fire alarms. So if the fire alarm does go off, expect the building to be starting to get warm and smoky and head out as quickly as possible and meet outside the Grand Hotel. For those of you who haven't been before, toilets are just through the door marked toilets, actually, and just on your left through there. In terms of attendance at the meeting, I have had apologies from Councillor Lomas, and Councillor Lucker is here with us today. I have had apologies from Councillor Galvin, who doesn't have a substitute, and Councillor Doughty has indicated he will be attending, but maybe a little bit late. Okay, item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Does anybody, members, have any interest to declare that are not on their register? Okay, item 2 is to approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of December 2022. All of those who are present happy to read those as a correct record? Okay, I'll sign those now. Which brings us to item 3 on the agenda, which is public participation. And we have 5 members of the public registered to speak today. Each of you will have loosely 3 minutes. There are more than one speaker today, so if you could try and keep it as close to 3 minutes as you possibly can, that'll make my life easier. The first member of the public we have registered to speak is Mr. Jeff Beacon. If I could invite you to the table, Mr. Beacon. And he's here to talk on climate and housing implications of the York Local Plan. 3 minutes starts when you're ready, Mr. Beacon.
The local plan pursues extreme gentrification, accelerating York's change from a working class city into a university class city. It brings a rise in house prices to benefit house owners and developers. Renters, mostly less affluent or young, will be losers. Many will be exiled. This situation was outlined in the report by OVARP in 2013. York's greenhouse gas emissions will not fall in line with York's declaration of a climate emergency. At last, the Council is considering commissioning a report on the consumption greenhouse gas emissions of York citizens, nearly 4 years after these were specified as a relevant measure in York's declaration. Such a report could have informed the sustainability of the local plan, but if it happens, it will be too late. The Council avoids acknowledging how York's greenhouse gas emissions are eating into the remaining carbon budget, which was set in the report to the Council commissioned from Professor Gouldson. Also, I can find nowhere where the Council acknowledges that in affluent areas of York, personal greenhouse gas emissions are several times those in poorer areas. The website carbon.place shows that affluent areas will exhaust Professor Goudson's budget in the coming year. UK's National Planning Policy Framework incorporates the United Nations Brundtland Resolution. This says we must not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In planning for new developments where residents will have very high emissions, the local plan violates the NPPF. I discussed this in evidence I tried to submit to the local plan inquiry. I also discussed how rising property values will force the left out affluent and their children from York. Please know that York has no definition of affordable housing. I was prevented from giving my evidence at the local plan hearing. Just before I was due to speak, I was approached by one of the inspectors, the programme officer and York Council officials. I was told I would not be allowed to present my evidence. I am writing to the Council's legal officer to raise this and 2 related issues, which potentially have very serious implications. Also, a comment by Inspector McCormack in this meeting should be tested. This was to the effect that the inspectors could ignore relevant evidence if it were not properly presented, even if they are aware of the evidence. This is not the case in a normal court of law. Will the chair meet with me and York's legal officer to discuss the refusal to accept my evidence and the legal position of violations of the National Planning Policy Framework, and then report back to the committee.
Obviously, can't get involved in those legal issues and leave that to the legal officer. Sorry, Mr. Baker. Thank you. In terms of those comments will be noted and taken on board, and I think you have your separate issues with the legal officer. I'll leave you to deal with those yourself. Thank you. Okay, the second speaker is Councillor Myers. I have no notes in terms of what you're saying.
Thank you, Chair and Committee. Good evening. I'm speaking in relation to item 4, Annex 3, very specifically number PMM49, the amendment at St Peter's School. More widely, I've got a query about the number of schools that have been looked at as part of this process, their educational land and the green fields around them, having amendments made at this stage of the local plan. It would be good as a committee if you could better understand the robustness of that process, if it's just a handful of schools that have been amended, or have they all been looked at? As a ward councillor, like many others around the table, we want to protect our designated green belt in our wards, and naturally myself and Councillor Wells are really alarmed by this amendment at this stage, which crucially takes away the presumption against development in this area by the riverside. And the elephant in the room is, of course, that recently plans have been submitted by St Peter's School to develop this green belt. Specifically, this is an important green wedge, lung belt for not only Clifton, but for the whole of the city. Indeed, in the York Central development plans, they outline how there's not enough open space amenity in this area by 16 hectares, which would be a much higher figure if the publicly inaccessible green space near it were also not included in the measurement. So put simply, in this area of the city, the Riverside, Clifton, Lehman Road, there's an open space deficit. And to add to that, the proposed development of this green belt wedge is in a flood level 3 area, even after all flood defence work is complete. The pump that operates in the area, the Burdyke pump, operates at capacity and isn't earmarked for any upgrades. During flood events, this means that water does enter people's homes, indeed, as it did on Boxing Day 2015. This potentially catastrophic event is made more likely by a decision to redefine Greenbelt in this critical area. I ask you, councillors on this committee, to propose removal of this one element of the amendments to protect the Greenbelt. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Myers. Your comments will be noted and probably come up as part of the discussion of the agenda item. Our third public speaker is Abby North of York Travellers Trust, trustee, who is here to speak on the Gypsy and Traveller provision. Okay, there is a little button in the middle somewhere that looks like a Wi-Fi symbol. If you press that one, and then you'll have 3 minutes when you're ready to start.
Okay, thanks for your time this evening. My name is Abby North. I'm a trustee at York Travellers Trust. I'm also a professional planning agent working with gypsies and travellers across the country. I'm also a bargee traveller myself, so I have some vested interest in this policy plan. York Travellers Trust has been working for years with York City Council to try and come to some sort of a sustainable solution for the accommodation crisis that faces gypsies and travellers in this city at this time. York, in my own personal experience and professional experience, York is different from councils across the city, across the country, in that all we see here is council-run sites. What there is a desperate need for in York is private family sites where people can get their own, like everybody else in the country, people want their own private home where they can bring up their families and access the same opportunities as everybody else in society. That is to say, education, welfare, all of the rest of it, good, decent job prospects. We don't have that in York. What we have with the policy that we've now got before us, I mean, I come to you in desperation at this stage, because the policy that I'm looking at now, we are setting ourselves up to fail. Not only the travelling communities that it's going to affect, but the council yourselves. This may not be a problem for the local plan working group anymore after this. It will be a problem for your community safety officers. It will be a problem for your housing team. The idea that you are going to create extra space for travellers by adding pitches to one of the most deprived traveller sites we have ever seen in this country at Osbaldwick is just, it absolutely beggars belief. We don't understand what on earth you are thinking to take an unmanageable, unworkable site and condemn children who haven't even been born yet to decades more of that kind of social exclusion and deprivation. There is a solution. There is a solution to these problems. Within York Travellers Trust, we have a professor of housing law. I am a professional traveller planning agent. We have a Romany gypsy lady who is our CEO. We have lived experience, professional experience. We can help you to solve these problems. But the way that we're looking at it now, it's just not going to work. The Section 106 agreements that you are relying on to provide the allocations for gypsies who don't meet the planning definition, and that is something that I just don't have time to tell you why you have got that so wrong at this stage. The Sections 106 are unenforceable. The only evidence we have got of them trying to work those is from this appeal decision I've got in front of me here, where it is confirmed they are not, such provision on those sites is not necessary to make the development acceptable, it's not directly related to the development, and does not fairly and reasonably relate in scale and kind to the development. That means it is legally unenforceable. So what are we going to say to developers? We say, we're going to stop you from building 999 desperately needed family homes in York because you don't want to provide us with 3 traveller pitches. Is there a moral justification for that? Certainly not. Of course not. We can't stop you building houses for that reason. What we need to do is provide a criteria-based policy for traveller sites that works, that we can use to provide private family sites so that people can get on with their lives in a culturally appropriate and safe, secure home. Okay, the council came forward to us in 2022, I think it was, I can tell you later, with a proposal to include traveller sites within the rural exceptions, within the exceptions for the Greenbelt policy, affordable housing. That's GB4. That is the only, because of the limitations of the Greenbelt in this city, the only way we are going to get what we need here is to make sure that where we have sites coming forward, we have an exception to say that in suitable circumstances, in appropriate cases, we can make an exception and build in the Greenbelt. Now, the council has acknowledged... We are up to 4 minutes now, Ms North. If you just 2 seconds more. Right, no problem. You have acknowledged in Osbaldwick, you have amended the boundary of the Greenbelt to make a very bad situation in Osbaldwick worse. If it is appropriate to take land out of the Greenbelt for traveller sites, why there? Why there? Why there? Why in a place where all we are doing is condemning people to further misery and the council themselves to a very hard situation in managing this site for decades to come? Let's look at if the Greenbelt policy for GB4, let the planning inspectorate make that decision. Please put that back in. Come and talk to us. We are here with our expertise to help you to solve this problem. But at the moment, I think maybe you can hear it. I am desperate to tell you we are setting everybody up to fail here. We've got to do something about this. It cannot go forward as it is. Thanks.
Thank you. Our fourth public speaker is Mr. Chris Bailey, who's here to talk on the proposals in paragraphs 28-31 in respect of policy D3, cultural wellbeing. 3 minutes, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody. I'm Chris Bailey. I represent York on the Creative Cities Network of UNESCO. And I want to speak about paragraphs 28-31, where the intention appears to be not to include any specific separate guidance on cultural provision and cultural well-being within the local plan. I want to take you back, if I may, first of all, to 2016 and a committee called York at Large, which was cultural organisations coming together with the council. We had already done a lot to demonstrate the relationship between culture and the economy and culture and health, setting up initiatives which dealt with that. And Chair, you will remember, I'm sure, that you mentioned that it would be very useful for that committee to take up the question of the local plan and to show similarly, to demonstrate similarly the contribution that culture could make to the local plan. We took the MPPF as our starting point, which you remember says it's about fostering well-designed, beautiful and safe places with accessible services and open spaces that reflect current and future needs and support communities' health, social and cultural well-being. We took the challenge seriously. We set up 4 Arts in Place meetings in 2017, organised by a bunch of 4 of us. Up to 100 people attended each of those meetings. They were big, noisy meetings attended by the then council leader, Chris Stewart, who at the conclusion of the 4th one instructed the then head of planning, Martin Granger, to get into conversations with the group to see what could be fashioned. That's where policy D3 came from. I'm glad to say that it didn't disappear, and there was a cross-party scrutiny on culture chaired by Councillor Luca, which endorsed that the importance of culture in relation to the local plan. And we'd also decided that we needed a culture strategy, and the recommendations and actions in York's Creative Future further strengthen that, talking about capitalising on the relationship between economy and place by embedding culture as a tool for local planning and decision making, and in so doing to influence the cultural well-being of York. That's the cultural strategy that the council also endorsed. So from the point of view of parties sitting within York, you could say that seems to have been thoroughly taken up. But I also want to mention the way York's regarded from the Creative Cities Network. This group of 280 something cities now evaluates each city every 4 years, and we're expected to report against the objectives of the network as a whole. And one of those, that we fully integrate culture and creativity into local development strategies and plans. And it will be very good with the plan that we're about to submit next year to be able to say that was a policy in the draft local plan is becoming fact and is providing guidance in the actual plan itself. York's own 10-year strategy, I'm glad to say, says that it supports residents' health and well-being through their lives, placing culture at the heart of placemaking, ensuring talent development and retention, and raising York's profile. Very good. So thus far, it sounds as though that plan should be followed by guidance. One way of tackling this, of course, is to continue the work of the group or something like it to help the council to fashion some sensible guidance for developers. By now, 2023, many councils around the country have provided that kind of guidance, especially London boroughs. So we're not short of good examples to follow.
Just approaching 4 minutes now, Mr. Bailey, if you could start to.
I would say that, please, York, you were in the lead. Please don't let this city fall behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. My comments will be noted as we go into the debate. And finally, our final speaker is Mr. Andrew Morrison, who's here to speak to support the progress on the local plan to question the abandonment of the SPD for cultural provision that is recommended within the working group. Mr. Morrison, you also have roughly 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillors. I'll be trying to be brief as possible. Andrew Morrison, I'm Chairman, no, I'm not, I'm Chief Executive of York Civic Trust and a member of the Council, the Culture Forum for the city. The Civic Trust and the Culture Forum both fully support the local plan and encourage the working group and the wider council and the public at large to move the plan forward towards adoption in 2023, as per the timetable set out in section 26 of the report before the meeting this evening. In reading the report, I was disappointed and somewhat surprised by the recommendation 2V, and in particular section 27 on supplementary planning documents, to remove a specific SPD, apologies for using the acronym, saves me some time, on culture. In 2018, and as far as I'm aware, all through, to my knowledge, all through the inquiry we've had last year, the council were committed to producing a thorough and wide-ranging set of SPDs, some of which, in association with the policies that they would support, are groundbreaking. And in particular, policy D3, as Chris Bailey has just mentioned, about cultural provision, probably the first one in any local plan in the UK. For that policy to be effective and to work, it needs a unique SPD, a supplementary planning document for cultural wellbeing. If we're to ask developers to provide cultural wellbeing plans for our major developments, the detail and the definition must come from a specific SPD, in our opinion. In MMM 8.4, and you made a modification 8.4 in your report, policy D3 only has one spelling correction. There is no mention of removing the commitment to develop an SPD for culture. Section 8.22 in the 2018 plan clearly states the council will produce an SPD outlining the requirements of a cultural wellbeing plan that should be required in an assessment for all development proposals going forward. D3 is an amazing policy and it needs to work. Where similar SPDs have been produced in other local authorities, City of London, the Borough of Wandsworth, cultural life in the city for residents has been reinforced and developed unbelievably compared to local plans that don't have that reference in their policy backed up by an SPD. So I really would urge the working group and the council to not remove the necessity for an SPD for culture and put it in. We have a cultural forum, we have a cultural strategy. This is a city of culture. So we need it in there, we really do. And my last point, still on the same section, in section 27, the list of SPDs, there is a 2018 commitment to produce a separate SPD for the local heritage list. But this does not appear in section 31, the proposal to consolidate SPDs going forward, nor in the specific recommendations for SPDs following that. That's the local heritage list SPD may simply have just fallen off the list, maybe an error, maybe me not being able to read it properly and not spotting it. Surely the City of York, we really do need very detailed definition when it comes to culture and to local heritage, particularly non-designated heritage, which that SPD would look after. Councillors, I thoroughly believe your culture and your non-heritage assets do need specific SPDs to produce the definition and the detail to make the local plan work, which ultimately is a really good local plan, and we need it quick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Again, your comments have been noted and taken part as part of the discussion. Okay, that takes us on to item 4 on the agenda, which is the City of York local plan. And I'll hand over to Neil Ferris to introduce. And also I will welcome back Alison Cook, who's been on hiatus. It's good to have you back, Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. The authority submitted in May 2018 its local plan to inspection for the Planning Inspectorate and to take forward. Since then, we've been through a national pandemic and 11 weeks of public inquiry in which the inspectors dealt with the whole plan in very much in a very detailed fashion, at one stage going through boundary section by boundary section. So respective Councillor Myers' representations as to did the inspectors go through every boundary in the city? Yes, they did. And in respect of the St Peter's School, they actually undertook a site visit and gave us recommendations in regard to that site. The local plan is subject to MPPF as a framework, so it's not a free-for-all in terms of our policies in that regard. And I'm glad to say that the plan has got further now than it has ever done before, and that we have nothing in terms of feedback from the inspectors that they have any significant concerns with the plan at this stage, or indeed any concerns at this stage. But clearly at this stage, it's not for them to opine on the final view of the plan. That will happen after this final consultation stage. The report recommends that we go to that final consultation stage. We would intend to carry out that consultation prior to PERDA, so we would start immediately after the calling period expires after executive, complete that consultation, thereafter get the consultation responses consolidated whilst ladies and gentlemen around this room are busy otherwise, and then we will submit to the planning inspector, who would write a final report and final recommendations with the proposal under the scheme of delegation to be that if there are no major proposals for changes to the inspector, that effectively myself and Councillor Eyre, or whichever executive member it was at that time, could take the report straight to full council for approval. In effect, that gives us the prospect of having a local plan in York by summer this year. The report itself also goes on to talk about a number of other planning related matters, such as the supplementary planning documents and the Article 4 directives and the petitions that the authorities received in respect of HMOs, and those are detailed within the report. If I just go into some of the comments that have made by some of the speakers, in terms of the climate change, we have updated the policies that were submitted in 2018 to reflect the latest national position. In respect of NPPF, we have gone as far as we can in terms of legally requiring developers to take forward climate change, but we have gone beyond that in the fact that we have also put in aspirational requirements in there for development to come forward and meet, so that they can be considered by the planning committees when they consider the applications coming forward. But it is not an open playing field. As I say, the local plan is brought forward through the NPPF guidelines, and we can't go beyond what is legislatively required, although we can aspire, which we have done. In terms of the respect of, and I'll just refer Councillor Mr. Beacon really to the concerns around the inspectors not allowing him to present evidence. You need to take that up with the planning inspectorate. The public inquiries are run and a matter of control by the planning inspectorate, so they determine how those.
Mr. Beacon, there is no public participation. Mr. Beacon, there is no public participation at this part of the meeting.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that clear for members around the room. It's not the council's role to allow people to or not to. So it was controlled by the inspectors. It was a matter for the inspectors to decide how to run their public inspection. In respect of the St Peter's School, as I've already highlighted, the inspectors specifically visited St Peter's School and took a tour of the site and looked at the setting of the site, and it decided that actually the river boundary provided a much more sustainable and long-term greenbelt boundary for that location. In respect of that visit, that also prompted them to ask us to just re-look at the greenbelt boundary application that we undertook in May 2018 around the whole city, where we'd similarly put really tight green belts up to school properties. So where there were playing fields, floodlit areas, tennis courts, etc., he asked us to look at those and review those in terms of providing a little bit more space around those school areas. And we undertook that review around all of those such locations around the city, and you see some of the amendments within the report before you as to where we've made those proposed adjustments. I must highlight the fact that the original greenbelt boundaries as submitted in 2018 were generally of that looser nature in terms of being reflecting the outer boundaries of the school. It was only when we revised during the planning process, or clarified during the planning process, the greenbelt boundary, that we brought them in tighter. So we've relaxed them back again to where members originally wanted those boundaries in many instances. In respect to the supplementary planning documents, the comments there, it should be worthwhile just reflecting to the planning committee, local planning working group, that these are supplementary planning documents. So the actual policies that will be taken into consideration by planning committee are in the local plan. A supplementary planning document can only provide clarification and interpretation of policy. So it's just worth reflecting that the nature of a supplementary planning document. Clearly, it will be a matter for executive to determine which supplementary planning documents they bring forward and ask officers to generate. What we've put forward in the plan is proposals to consolidate the very long list we had originally, in order that some of those cross-cutting themes can be considered in a more structured way across the supplementary planning documents that are now recommended in this report. Clearly, if you have a huge list of supplementary planning documents that have to be considered within every application, it becomes very difficult for anybody to hold all of those priorities in your mind at any one particular time. So they start to water down the impact of having supplementary planning documents. So the idea of consolidation, and it is literally a proposal from officers, this would be a matter for members to determine. The concept with the proposals in the report is to give logical, consolidated supplementary planning documents with thematic issues within them, therefore providing clearer pieces of information or clearer guidance for developers, and also for the interpretation by decision makers, rather than having a plethora of documentation to consider on each application. But clearly, in respect to particularly the cultural supplementary planning document, I understand that the speaker was correct. There is a reference in the plan itself to having a supplementary planning document, so that's something members may wish to consider. Is that fair? Yep. Thank you.
I'll open up to questions and comments. Councillor Pavlik.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if Neil will be able to just speak on Gypsy and Travellers. It covered everybody's, other than the Gypsy and Traveller. I do have other questions, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So on Gypsy and Travellers, so in terms of the provision of private sites, the concept within the local plan on the strategic, the concept within the local plan on the Gypsy and Traveller sites is that we will be providing private sites through the strategic sites. So those sites will be provided by developers for the Gypsy and Traveller community, with the concept that these new developments should be fully inclusive developments. So if you look at the Langwith development, 3,500 homes down there to the southeast of the city, the Clifton Gate new village to the north of the city, 1,300 homes, that those communities should incorporate with them provision for a truly multicultural community, and that would include Gypsy and Traveller communities. And doing this on the strategic sites allows those developers to design from the start those villages in such a way that various lifestyles could be accommodated and not effectively cause community friction. So because we're designing these facilities right from the scratch. In respect of the site specifically down at Oswald, which we referred to, the amendments that you see within the report reflect similarly to schools, a tightening of the Greenbelt that occurred when we undertook a review of the Greenbelt methodology, and now once again a loosening of the Greenbelt. We haven't gone back to the 2018 red line. We've effectively taken only half of the adjacent field in respect to the Osbaldwick site, because between that half of the Osbaldwick site and the Clifton Gate site, we have identified sufficient capacity for additional council plots within the plan. But again, just reflecting it in terms of the overall need of 44 sites, the vast majority of those sites will be provided by the private sector, dispersed across the city, as was the desire of the public speaker.
Councillor Pavlik.
Sorry, just on that though, and I'm just trying to find the reference that I marked. Doesn't it say that you'd be accepting off-site contributions for private sites, which will then put it into the council's hands, which will then mean that it will just add to Osbaldwick. And as you've already heard, the issue with Osbaldwick of social exclusion and deprivation that the speaker referenced, surely just continually expanding Osbaldwick is not really what she was asking for.
I'll let Laura address the issue in terms of, I'll let Laura address the first part of the question, and I'll address the Osbaldwick site piece.
Certainly, yes. So in terms of how we've looked at the provision and delivery of financial contributions, we've done a couple of things. So we've assessed through looking at a trajectory of what could come forward, where we know that sites have already made a commitment to a financial contribution. We've had to make that assumption that going forward, that's how that provision will be provided. And for all other sites, all of the strategic sites, we're making the assumption that they will be delivered as Neil has just described on site. And to support that approach even more, we have proposed further modifications to the policies to specifically tighten the approach that needs to be taken when considering the provision of pitches on strategic sites. So we've made much clearer the way in which an off-site contribution, financial contribution, would only be considered in very, very exceptional circumstances. And we've made clear exactly what the developer would have to do to demonstrate that it would not be achievable on site through consideration of the site-specific constraints that exist and any other matters, effectively saying that we don't expect developers to be able to demonstrate that they can't achieve it on site, because, again, as Neil said, we're making sure that these are coming forward right at the start of the design and master planning approach to these strategic sites. So from our position, we don't see there being any fundamental issue that arises that would prevent that happening. So therefore, the provision on the Osbaldwick site that we have earmarked will really only be for those sites that have already benefited from planning permission, and those financial contributions have been agreed or a commitment made to those in one way or another. So that the expansion of that site will be limited and certainly isn't anticipated to accommodate all of the provision that's necessary across the plan period.
Thank you, Laura. So I think to articulate that to members for a perspective of sitting on the planning committee, the bar is incredibly high, and in terms of the tools that we've given you through the policy, in order for a developer to come forward and suggest that they aren't going to make provision on site going forward. The lack of such a strong policy in terms of the strategic sites that have got planning permission to date has allowed for that leeway in terms of the off-site provision. In terms of the Osbaldwick site, I recognise the issues that were brought forward in terms of the management. And I think that that's a matter of management rather than, and as rightly pointed out, a matter for the housing officers and the housing function of the authority. And in that regard, the proposals down at the Osbaldwick site and the additional capital that will be invested within the site through those off-site contributions and the council's commitment to that site, we envisage that actually will give us greater capacity to make sure that we manage that site more effectively than has been historically done. And we would recognise that we would suggest that the delivery of this plan in terms of the overall city's capacity to manage and work with the Gypsy and Traveller community will be increased, because we reflect that relationship and that management function needs improving. But that is not a planning issue; that's a managerial issue.
Councillor Prophet.
I apologise for labouring the point, but I do think it was a really heartfelt presentation, and I do want to make sure that it gets properly addressed. So you're saying that the bar will be incredibly high. So in a 900, 150, 200 house development, will the LPA then be recommending refusal to a planning committee if the developer says, well, we're not going to deliver 2 pitches? And I think that's the fundamental question that needs to be asked, because if they're not, and they're going to say, well, yeah, it's 2 pitches, we'll take the off-site contribution and we'll still recommend approval, then that does tie the hands to some extent of a planning committee.
Yeah. My expectation that the policy is drafted is that planning officers would have an extremely hard time making a recommendation to approve without a thorough analysis by the developer that they cannot develop on site. This is a matter that I personally think is really important for the City of York to have mixed communities. And part of developing mixed communities, we're talking, a small town at 3,500 residents in the Langwith proposal. We're talking about a brand new village of 1,500, for example, up at ST7 at Clifton Gate. For those communities to exclude the full cross section of society, I think is an abdication of responsibility. So if therefore I think there's absolutely. I think the policy as has been written, we are informed by our lawyers who have assisted us drafting this, is as high a bar as we can make in the fact that they have really got to demonstrate they cannot do it. Now, when you're looking at those sites, for example, we're talking about greenbelt sites where there is nothing there at the moment. They've got to build everything. So it's going to be really difficult to demonstrate. And I've already had these conversations with both of those main developers. We do not see at this stage that there is any rationale that you can bring forward where you cannot design your new community without that doesn't accommodate a fully integrated proposal. I'm not saying they like the conversation, but that's what it's happening.
Sadly, I shan't be on planning committee to see how this policy actually works, but my cynicism is high.
Okay, any further questions or comments from members? I can pick it up after the meeting, but there's no public participation after the public participation section, unfortunately. But I'm happy to have a conversation with you after the meeting. Councillor Fisher.
I'll write to you, Councillor. I'll explain that to you. I think the bar would be, is it legally enforceable? And the answer to that is no.
Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I'm talking about PMM 96 on pages 127 to 130 and the maps on page 187 and 188 concerning strengths of common buffer zones. Obviously, there's a 400-metre buffer zone around the site, which no net increase in residential development will be allowed, and there's a 5.5 kilometre zone in which there will have to be proof that the development doesn't affect it. I welcome this greatly because Strensall Common is an incredibly important area of nature, very dear to my heart. I know one gentleman has walked his dog on there, will probably agree with me. What concerns me is, however, the 400-metre buffer and the 5.5 kilometre buffer are not exclusively within our area. They also go into Rydale District Council, which will become North Yorkshire on the 31st of March. Unfortunately, about 5 years ago, Rydale District Council gave permission for a campsite over the border, which is now having a significant impact in terms of use by visitors to the area who not appreciate the unique nature of Strensall Common. Does this local plan pose any obligation on the new planning authority in North Yorkshire to take into account this policy when they grant developments further out?
Do you want to have a go for that now?
It's a very good point that you raise, and we are addressing it specifically with neighbouring authorities to make them aware that this is what we're showing. Obviously, the policy that sits behind that has been in formulation for a number of years. It's the expression of that on the policies map that we've introduced here to help guide that application of the policy. And indeed, we would expect development falling adjacent to the York boundary to recognise this in respect of residential development. Obviously, it's very much dependent on the type of nature of development that comes forward. But the presence of Strensall Common should be picked up in any case through that particular application's HRA and the evidence that supports a planning application. So that would need a necessary response, and I would anticipate that would trigger a realisation that this exists. What can't happen, or we can't expect, is that a development plan for York would have material weight for somewhere else in Rydale or wherever else it may be. But the evidence that supports our policy is very much relevant to those neighbouring authorities, and as I say, through that duty to cooperate and the working relationship that we have with officers over the border, they're very much aware of this, and will be considering how they take it forward through the updates and changes to their policy approaches.
Thank you.
Councillor Pavlovic. You were waving earlier, is it?
I did wave at you earlier. I've got a long list. I've got a long list of questions. I don't know
take some of that. I'll go
elsewhere
elsewhere and come back to you.
Yeah, cool. Right. Just A basic question. I read in the examiners, in one of your letters to the inspectors, that you were expecting a response from them in December. Was that right? About the phase 2, 3 and 4 hearings and their observations. When are we expecting their feedback from the hearings?
So the inspectors aren't going to respond to us in terms of a final say at this stage, but we've had verbal confirmation that there are no more matters that they wish to draw to our attention. And that was in my opening comments to yourselves, that at this time we've got no indication that there is any concerns, material or otherwise, with the plan and its amendments as put before you tonight.
Okay, right, that's helpful. And then I've got a couple of just textual bits, and then one sort of really fundamental question. In the bit about the Article 4 office to residential conversion, you've referenced in other parts of the of this report that they were subject to full council motions. Now, you may or may not recall, I proposed just what we've got in here in March 2021, which was amended by Councillor Eyre and Councillors Eyre and Doughty, which were accepted, and it went through. I think it should be referenced that there was a full council motion on that matter. It just gives it a little bit more weight to say that it was a council.
It did prompt the entry, so I'll make sure that that's drawn to the attention of executive next week.
Cool, thank you. One really odd thing in the modifications, it takes out the word should be supported, not supported, and replaces it by the word permitted. And I'm particularly looking at something like PBSA, and it says PBSA will be permitted where it can demonstrate these various criteria. Is that wording semantics, or why does it not retain supported? Because it does in other bits of the amendments. I'm just wondering about it tying the hands of a planning committee. That's all I'm worried about.
On that one specifically, there's quite a precise list of requirements that that policy sets out. So the expectation on that one is that should all of those provisions be met, then there's no other reason not to support or not to bring forward and advance the permission. So it would be permitted. So it's
a rubber stamping exercise from a planning committee.
Well, there's less. The expectation is that all of those should be met, in which case permission should be granted, as opposed to the expectation that only some of them should be met, in which case there'll be general support. The requirement is that all of those provisions, and off the top of my head I can't recall exactly what they are, but there's quite a list of them, particularly around the nomination agreement and the contribution to affordable housing. They're explicit expectations, which would then render an application compliant with the policy, and therefore permission should be forthcoming, as opposed to more flexibility given if it's a permissive approach or a supportive approach. Sorry.
Okay. It was just an explanation of why that wording had been changed from one thing to another in some areas and not in others. And then my sort of more fundamental point is in paragraph 12, you've talked about the target of affordable housing being increased from 35% to 45%. So 45% of the affordable housing requirement for the city will be delivered through the plan period, which is progress, and it's something that we asked for. What I'm worried about, Laura, is how's that going to actually be achieved without then increasing the thresholds? You provided an exercise for the examiners, because I was at that hearing, where you gave the 20 largest sites, I think they were, and looked at them with increasing affordability thresholds for both greenfield and brownfield sites, and only 3 were marginal, and 3 were unviable. The rest were all viable with a much higher percentage. Why have you not, given that this is going out now to consultation as a major modification, I'm mindful of what Neil said, that the examiners haven't come back with any major concerns, but I'm surprised, because I thought affordable housing was an issue that they did have some concerns about, is how we're going to achieve 45% if you're not increasing the thresholds.
So you may also recall that we were asked to specifically provide a note that addressed this issue, which we did, and which is part of the examination library. And that sets out in detail the level of need that the evidence through the local housing need assessment identifies, and works through what are known elements of the affordable housing supply based on the policy approaches drafted and the thresholds that are in that policy, but also introduces the changes through proposed modifications on things such as the student housing accommodation and the contribution there, and paints a picture of expected supply through the plan period. And as you rightly said, it positions that at around 35%. And that's through looking only at those specific supply elements. What we also know is that there are elements of future housing supply which aren't captured in those assumptions, and will therefore bring forward and contribute additional affordable housing. Indeed, the council's own housing delivery strategy is expected to elevate the amount of affordable housing that will be above the policy contributions. There are numerous other windfall sites which aren't captured, because our windfall calculation only deals with relatively small sites. So we know that other windfall will be subject to those thresholds as well. So all of those unknown knowns fed into that calculation as well. And we felt that we were able to say that, broadly speaking, we could target 45% of the local housing, of the affordable housing need as being achievable. It certainly pushes at boundaries, but it would be achievable and could be seen as pushing harder against what that kind of benchmark 35% is.
Yeah, and you know, I get that you said the 20% and 30% thresholds were minimums, and there would be the opportunity to negotiate. But I think, as I said at the time, you know, how many developers are going to voluntarily increase their thresholds if they don't have to? And what we heard at the hearing were a number of developers saying we could live with a higher threshold. Some said they'd rather they didn't, but some said we could live with a higher threshold. And I'm just thinking that, you know, we're at the stage that we're at is, you know, even a 5% uplift on to 25% and 35% actually would make a tangible difference when you look at the plan in its entire context.
It would make it. I don't argue that it wouldn't make a difference in terms of supply, but even a 5% uplift on that threshold has quite fundamental viability effects.
But you proved that it didn't, and you were talking about a much higher percentage than that when you presented that paper.
Yeah, but in the so yes, it doesn't. But we have to see it in a context of other changes as well, including the likelihood of SIL coming forward, and other modifications that we've introduced in regard to the accessibility standards and pushing on the climate change standards, all of which are jostling for position on and fighting for a piece of the developer pie effectively. So whilst on paper there's headroom to extend those thresholds, it would have been challenging to do during the examination process and reopen that whole debate. But we were seeing it also in the context of those other competing requirements as well. So it was felt that we could stick with that, and it would allow some negotiation definitely on individual sites, but that negotiation was seen as overall a beneficial position to be in, and particular sites will undoubtedly demand different points of negotiation and different things to be pushed harder on than others perhaps, and the approach that we've adopted through the modifications and what the plan will do is will allow colleagues in development management to do that.
I just reflect that the plan as submitted was the plan as submitted and approved by members. It was members that chose those levels that effectively officers have demonstrated are sound policy. I know, and it's just to reflect where they came from. Is that those levels and those policies were as submitted by council, and the officers and the inspection process has demonstrated that those levels are sound. And in that regard, whilst there are in some instances additional headroom, then again there's the opportunity, and that we discussed at executive, the opportunities for such mechanisms such as SIL. I would also just highlight that the authority's own sites in terms of the housing delivery programme are benefiting significantly from Homes England's additional funding for going above policy. So where there's a policy such as we have here and proposed in this plan, there's greater opportunities for us as an authority to say, well, actually, those extra additional houses actually attract public funding. So whereas if it's below policy, or there's a section 106 that effectively says we can't achieve policy because of the viability, there's no public funding available because you're not going above policy. So there are no simple answers here, but I just reflect that those are things that were originally members' choices.
I'm going to go over there for a while, if that's okay. Councillor Smalley.
Thank you, Chair. My cycle here did something to my nose, and so I think I might have been out of the room when Neil was finishing off the conversation on SPDs, but it's really just to start, hopefully, a discussion on what the final two speakers, Andrew Morrison and Chris Bailey, talked about in terms of the cultural wellbeing SPD. And I guess what you said, if you could expand upon your discussion there, particularly, I guess, the difference between first on the option there. So it's within paragraph. No, I can't find it at all now. But how, I guess I can get the rationale between them being all throughout all SPDs and within the local plan generally. But I guess particularly on cultural wellbeing, how you came to the judgment that should be out there, and I guess is there still that consideration that members might want to discuss today?
I think, as I highlighted this out, just to reflect the nature of supplementary planning documents, they are effectively a reflection of more clarity on a particular policy, rather than they can't generate new policy in themselves. So that the policy that you've got within the plan, I would recognise as being a strong policy, and a policy that is in itself going to provide opportunities for committees to take forward in terms of the planning process. As to the consolidation of the supplementary planning documents, it was just from a perspective of undertaking a review of all the long list of supplementary planning documents that have come forward over the years as we've gone through the planning process, and seeking to consolidate those and say to ourselves as officers, if we were looking at interpreting this with developers, and then subsequently with members, the ability to actually say, well, all these issues are addressed in all of these policies, that there's a mechanism where we can effectively make sure that they're given most effect. And I think what we've tried to do in terms of those cross-cutting pieces is where there is sort of pervasive issues across all policies, all supplementary planning documents, such as the equalities duty, health and well-being, climate change. They matter to everything. And I suppose this my context in terms of the cultural and heritage pieces, again, they matter across all aspects. It will be a matter for members to approve those supplementary planning documents, and it will be for yourselves to consider whether or not there's enough clarity being given in those supplementary planning documents to this issue. But what I would say is it doesn't preclude members considering reinstating that as a supplementary planning document either now or at a later date if you felt that it was appropriate. This is just a recommendation in terms of management of the scale of what your members and developers have got to consider.
Yeah, no, thank you, Neil. And I guess, yeah, posed it as a discussion because I recognise it's not the sort of last hurrah in terms of discussing this paper. But just given that we had two public speakers, did want to have it raised at this meeting. And yeah, it was just and like you allude to, just between they're not the paragraphs, but within 61 and 62, just that difference there. But you've already spoken about that. And I guess sat here today, Andrew Morrison, who's vice chair of the Cultural Forum's executive, not just a member, as he said, and Chris Bailey said, obviously an awful lot of work went into that SPD and has continued since. So I know there's been really productive discussions between, for example, the Sport and Active Leisure team with the Culture Forum about how Sport and Active Leisure team work within their planning remit in terms of looking at good practice and how you develop a sort of document that would aid both those sort of cultural practitioners and organisations, but also those bringing forward planning applications to work with what was outlined in that SPD. Yeah. So I guess just to thank the two speakers for coming along tonight, and just pleased that there's still that availability to have that. Well, they're still available to have that flexibility.
Yeah, all I would reflect is that there's no suggestion at all from officers in these recommendations that these issues are so shall we say subservient to the ones that will be formed. It's just reflecting that these are planning documents and that it's about the planning process and it's a clarification of policy, and as I said previously, the equalities in climate change, for example, are important across all supplementary planning documents. So it's felt there's an opportunity to extract it alongside culture, if that's ultimately where members wish to go with it.
As we continue that trip down memory lane, I go to Councillor Looker, I think was chair of the scrutiny committee.
Yes, I mean, I do want to just, I'm grateful that Councillor Smalley raised that point, because it was very much on my mind that I felt we hadn't quite got, and I'm still not quite sure that I have understood it exactly. You probably need to spell it out slightly more simplistically. But I do think, and I do think sometimes you can get the culture and the heritage muddled. Heritage is particularly, and York is obviously hugely important as a heritage site, because we have got an enormous history. And we do recognise that, and I think we look at it, and there's all sorts of issues around our looking at planning to recognise that. Culture is more diffuse. I'm thinking particularly of some of the things that have come forward where what are seen as cultural opportunities for people, not perhaps the big mainstream ones, but the smaller ones, music venues for a start, have been incredibly vulnerable, because a developer says, well, nobody uses it nowadays, or hardly anybody comes, or it isn't making any money, or it's too noisy for the people. And I do think I would have liked to see, quite frankly, and I would have welcomed to see a specific cultural SPD that will reflect some of these perhaps more marginal cultural benefits that affect a lot of people, not just in the city centre, but people across the wider York area, and particularly perhaps are going to look at what opportunities there are in these new, we hope, development areas. I remember vividly some of the many complaints that came out of the huge builds in Haxby and Huntington, in that there were no community facilities built in to them at all. And it took ages and ages and ages before we were able, or people were able, to carve out. And if you've got those community spaces built into your requirements, then I think you're going to be in a much better position to provide a good place for people to live. And it's the cultural opportunities that make York a fantastic place to live. Thank you.
Did you want to come back in there, Neil?
Do you want to do the community?
Yes, so just a reminder that there is a separate policy on community facilities in addition to cultural facilities as well. So the plan covers both of those aspects and takes a position of a presumption against loss, effectively. So they're protected as far as they can be through the policy.
And just on that nuanced detail about the culture, and I entirely agree with. I mean, I helped that in, as part of the committee at the time when we were discussing the value of culture in terms of the economy. I think just reflecting that again, that the supplementary planning document is restricted to effectively providing clarification of the policies in the plan. It can't effectively expand and create and take on board non-planning matters. It has to say these are the policies in the plan, and here is how we are interpreting them as a planning authority. So it provides additional guidance, and so it doesn't expand upon those things, no matter how worthy they are. But there are other opportunities through strategies that the authority has got to effectively start to deal with content, whereas the planning policy deals with effectively physical provision of space.
Councillor Smalley.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just to there we go. Thank you. And just to thank Councillor Looker, I completely agree there. And I think that's sort of hit the nail on the head that I'm not on planning committee, and whether I've missed out over the last 3.5 years or whether that's been a benefit, I'm not sure. But completely agree that actually it's not just those members sat around or officers sat around the table. It's immensely helpful to those in the industry and in the sector to have really easy and digestible and informative information that they can quickly point to and not have to go through the original sort of local plan context. And that's why I guess supplementary planning documents are very helpful to have that sort of everything on not one page, but several hundred perhaps, for those organisations. And mentioning live music venues, I was speaking to a officer of the Music Venues Network, quite impromptu on a Saturday evening at a local independent music venue. Just catching up about everything that's happened in York over the last few years, and you mentioned some of those deeds of easement issues, and I guess what happened there was, it was looking back over that and going down some memory lane, like you say, it absolutely is that having context and information in a really clear place, and I guess that's where an SPD is super helpful. But recognise, like you say, Neil, that actually the brunt of the issue is the local plan and the policies in that, and that actually that isn't affected, and this SPD discussion is almost separate to that.
Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I was going to ask if we could, as part of the recommendations, have a specific note to say that we'd like a specific SPD on cultural activities. I do note what the officer says around how SPDs aren't there to create new policy, but I do think even in just providing clarity on policy areas, that can in itself be strengthening whenever awkward cases come up. I'm only putting it forward because we all seem to agree that we really like it, and we'd like to sort of help the cultural sector as much as we can. I'll go with the collective view as ever, just an idea. Cheers.
Okay, now Councillor de Gorn has indicated twice. Councillor Cuthbertson has indicated once. Were those two references towards this particular item? Because I do have other people waiting. Councillor Cuthbertson, was this about? Right. So is there anybody else who wants to speak regarding cultural SPDs?
Was that a proposal, councillor Taylor?
I,
Because if so, I might endorse it.
I was going to come to that, Councillor.
Yes, yeah, it was, yeah.
Well, I'll be with you there.
So this is a working group. This is a working group that advises the executive. So my suggestion was going to be that we ask officers to update executive that there are concerns, and necessarily the right words, that the issue of the lack of the SPD for the cultural issues was noted by the working group, and ask for an update to be brought back and for that to be considered by executive as part of that official decision-making proposal, if we're happy. Can that gibberish make it into the minutes in terms of
You're okay.
yeah, if you can, don't go back to the tape and see what I said, but something along those lines. Okay, so moving on to different issues, I next had Councillor Orwell.
Thank you, Chair. The modification for the land north of Monk's Cross says it should deliver high quality, frequent and accessible public transport. As we are currently fighting to save our buses locally, successfully at the moment, will this requirement be built into the 106 agreement so that we know that bus companies can drop services almost at a whim? How are we going to protect these services over a period of time?
I'll let Laura pick up the specifics on the site, but more broadly, because some members will be aware in terms of the section 106 agreement we had for Derwentthorpe, for example, that supported a bus service for a period of time with the section 106 contribution. So in terms of the ability of the developer to contribute towards, we can't effectively give them an obligation in perpetuity to provide a bus service. But effectively what we asked them to do is provide a effectively upfront funding to provide a service for a period of time to effectively generate footfall and customer patronage from the development, that then if there is insufficient demand from the development, it becomes a sustainable commercial service. So that's how the mechanism works, and I'll let Laura touch upon the specifics of the site.
Just for clarity, we're talking about the Monk's Cross site that's just received planning permission. So in that respect, the policy approach that we've taken here has now been superseded by the decision that's come forward. So the 106 that's been agreed on that will capture all of that. If for whatever reason that, and I doubt it will happen, but if it were to come back to the table and a new outline application be presented to the council, then the requirements of that policy would clearly come into play in a slightly different way. But currently, as it stands, it's the role of the 106 that's there at the moment to lead and direct the way that the public transport's coming forward. And I don't know precisely what has been agreed on that. Unfortunately, I'm not party to the details. But I would anticipate that there's something in there about it.
I was going to ask if you did know more in that. The site will take several years to develop. When do these bus services come into operation? The beginning, the end, or the middle?
Again, it will be detailed as part of the phasing strategy that I would anticipate being in the 106 agreement, which I'd have to look at and provide detail, use that detail to confirm.
There's no point in bus services starting when the estate's finished, because by then patterns of behaviour will have been set.
I think in terms of that specific site, the decision has been made. We'll convey the details to you so you can understand them yourself. I just outline that it's an outline planning application approval, so master planning still needs to be done and submitted. So there's still opportunities in terms of some of the fine detail to be refined, but the overall principle's been agreed.
Just in general, though, this will apply to many sites around, won't it? So
very much so.
The principles
absolutely
need to be established.
Oh, very much so, and it's particularly in those sites where they're effectively creating new communities. That's a significant part of the proposals that have been brought forward.
Councillor Pavlik on that point.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to take that final point of Councillor Orrell and Neil's last comment, is the sustainable transport SPD should cover issues including design of highways and public transport services. And what I'm worried about is your sequencing. We'll essentially, fingers crossed, have a plan adopted by the summer. If we don't have a sustainable transport SPD that runs pretty much alongside it, we're going to end up with developers coming forward without us having that backup SPD. So I wanted to really ask you, and was around your sequencing. I do remember seeing a list of when various SPDs were likely to be completed, and I think the first 2 or 3 we were talking about the early part of 2024 for completion. Where is the sustainable transport bit in your sequencing?
We haven't identified it specifically. The ones that we have identified in the local development scheme that you're referring to, on the affordable housing and the climate change ones, because they're well underway at the moment. The sustainable transport one is being worked out with colleagues in highways department, but isn't at a final or kind of formalised stage yet. And I would suggest it's for members to decide.
So, do you not think that that's a risk? Do you not think we are potentially storing up? Sorry, Richard. Do you not think we're potentially storing up a whole world of problems here? If we get a rush of developers coming forward in the early months post-adoption with plans without that sort of design backup.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the timing and the sequencing, so just reflecting that the adoption of the local plan will give the spatial distribution of development for the city for the first time. So effectively that gives you the sense of, if you know, it might frame it as to where people are going to come from and go to. And that was a big part of the work that was undertaken by the transport team in support of the local plan process. So that then leads to 2 things really from the local authorities' perspective. That gives you the opportunity to develop a local transport plan that reflects that new distribution of people and journeys across the city, and that analysis has been formed a big chunk of the local plan evidence bases to demonstrate that these sites are sustainable sites. It then gives the opportunity, once the plans are adopted and where we are currently in terms of the practical position today, it gives you the opportunity to reflect in the local transport plan as well the detail that's come forward in the local plan, but it also in tandem allows you to then take the supplementary planning document and add detail onto the actual delivery of policy. But in respect of are we at risk, it's, as I think, as I've alluded to a number of times, it's the policies in the plan in respect to transport that have the teeth and deal with the fundamentals. It's the supplementary planning documents that just provide clarification. And I would note that in respect of the major sites where you would expect the major transport issues to be effectively impacted, those sites are subject to an awful lot more work that they've got to do, and we're not expecting either of those, any of the major sites in terms of their planning pieces to come forward immediately as the plan does. Because if you look, for example, at the Langwith site, it's looking at 2027, the Fulford site looking at 28, I think Clifton Gate is slightly earlier, but again, in terms of the fundamental expectations of a sustainable transport, I don't think we are at risk.
No, and I absolutely concede that the sequencing of the massive sites will come later in the plan period. but we are talking about potentially a number of considerable sized developments coming forward in the early years of the plan, and we've all seen the trajectory and the plan sequencing of when things are likely to come on stream. And what my worry is that unless you have a sustainable transport SPD in place and ready, what you run the risk of is entrenching car-focused developments where you don't have that sustainability built in. And I think if you don't have that as your backup early doors, and that's all I'm asking for really, is the SPD, a sustainable transport SPD, to be sequenced higher up the priorities list.
Yeah, the sequencing will be a matter for members to prioritise, and clearly there's considerations, like I said, there's a significant amount of modelling work that's been done for the plan itself, the expectations of executive in terms of the delivery of the local transport plan, and therefore the logical time for doing it. I do think that in respect to the car-based development piece, that's fundamentally encaptured in the policies themselves. The supplementary planning document wouldn't be able to effectively impose such a significant sort of variation from policy. So whatever the policy says, the supplementary planning document would have to reflect that. You can't go beyond that.
Councillor Wood has said it's maybe around the same area, or you may be deviating. But Councillor de Graan, I have not forgotten about you.
I might start talking about Easter if you're not careful. Can I just summarise what I'm hearing, Neil? So my understanding is that within all this and the 40 years that it's taken, 40, 50, I keep being whatever it is that it's taken to get it to this stage. The bit that's got the teeth is the policy, which are all the bits that you mentioned here that we've had discussions about, the MM11s, the MMs, whatever else. So they're what drives it. Then if we want to optionally add some clarification to that, we can, which is why, you know, the climate change stuff and the housing stuff, because it started from a different direction, can add that quite quickly. But just to Michael's point, it is the policies that drive it, but the policies that give it a little bit extra understanding of what's going on. So we shouldn't be too nervous about the fact we haven't got a plethora of the policies. And when we do get too many of them, which is sounding like it may happen, we'll have to consolidate them so we can all remember which is where and how. Is that a fair summary of what I'm hearing, or am I missing the point?
It is indeed an excellent summary, and yes, it essentially the material weight is attributed to the policy, so that's what you give the decision, and the planning application exercise is wedded to is the compliance and consistency with the policy. The supplementary planning document just simply provides additional clarification and explanatory text. It would be in effect a longer set of paragraphs that follow the policy, really. It wouldn't add any other any other weights to it.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Sorry, Chair, I don't mean to talk over you. But it says in paragraph 37, a sustainable transport SPD is required to set out the transport design standards. It's not, it's an optional, it's not, it's nice that it would add a little bit of more detail, emphasis, whatever. It says it's actually required. So is an SPD on sustainable transport a requirement, or is it a nice add-on?
It provides clarification of the standards that you would expect to effectively achieve the policy.
So it's not required.
It's not required. So probably required is it's in the context of required to set out transport design standards. If you don't choose to set out standards, then it's not required. So I'm dancing on the head of a pin.
You are.
So
yeah.
I would say, for plain speaking, it's not required. But in the context of the sentence, it's probably correct. But we're nuance in there.
I was clear as mud, name. I said sorry to the finance officers. Councillor de Gorn.
Right. My question relates to the modifications to the greenbelt boundaries, which obviously quite a lot of the modifications are in response to that change as advised by the inspectors. I noted from looking through the documents where this is applied, that the original justification was around education establishments to, as you've described, to draw the boundary less tightly so that there's more flexibility for the education use of adjacent land. But I'm particularly interested in, on page 210, the ST36 Infeld Barracks and the land which was included in Greenbelt originally, which is a sports facility, not for school, but for the army use. I can understand the logic behind saying, on balance, this shouldn't be included in Greenbelt, but we have in the modifications, and very much welcome on, they're on page 63 and 64, 3.71 to 74, I think, are some amendments to the description of the policy that goes with this site. And there's some welcome additions there about MM 3.74 says an agreed master plan to ensure that the ST36 respects the historic nature of the site and buildings and the history of the barracks and so forth. So that's welcome. But then the original site allocation talks about 769 dwellings, which is obviously a significant number of dwellings, even though it's a large site, given the fact that we've also got a sort of a requirement to protect the history of the site as part of any redevelopment. So I suppose the question I'm really asking is, where we have a revised boundary for the Greenbelt, does that, the land that's taken out of the Greenbelt, does that effectively become white land that you then can allocate for whatever anyone then comes along? So it could be a windfall site or whatever, or is it intended for a site boundary for the, like ST36 would be subject to being revised to include that site? That's really the question.
Yes, so as it stands at the moment, the boundary of ST36 isn't proposed to be modified. It's simply the Greenbelt boundary, so it is white land that it becomes. Now, clearly, it's part of the barrack site and will be part of the estates disposal process when that occurs. And you would naturally expect that that would form part of a wider development. Now, whether it does or not isn't necessarily problematic for this stage of the plan, in that there are policies that would guide that bit of the site if it were to come forward separately, but equally it could naturally form part of the master planned approach that the policy talks about, even though the policy refers only to the allocation. It wouldn't, it would be inappropriate to divorce the two in that regard. And the principles that the policy draws on in terms of reflecting on the appropriate character and nature of the area would apply equally to that part of the site, even though it's not technically part of the allocation. You couldn't ignore the fact that its context is important, and they would be the things that you would draw on. So it may well become a bigger site, but the policy, there are policies there to guide its development, and also guide that interrelationship with the Greenbelt boundary as it's revised, and the relationship with the stray. That would be governed by different policy in the plan too.
Just to follow on from that, I mean, obviously this is out for consultation, so presumably it'll be up to the landowner to put forward whatever views that they have. But the estimate of the housing presumably was done on the basis of certain assumptions, but we're now adding more specifically reference to the historic nature. Does that change the sort of the density of a site allocation?
No, I would suggest that we're not changing the policy approach in that particular modification. What we've done is, if you look at the text that's struck through below that paragraph that you referred to, we've consolidated and refined what was originally set out in the policy, and in this case specifically made it MPPF compliant. There was some of those provisions which technically made an assumption that certain buildings should be retained, and actually we couldn't make that judgment until an assessment had been done. So there were particular technicalities that we had to address on that one, and it was felt that that consolidation was a neater and easier way to come forward with and a policy that could be taken forward through a master plan approach.
And just to sort of finish on there is one which specifically paragraph, I think it was in originally, that refers to the 3.75 that refers to the hydrological work about the impact on the stray, because obviously at the moment this area is open land, part of a drainage that covers the whole of the stray. And if it were to come forward for development, that would need to be taken into account in terms of what alternative uses it might be put to.
Yes, sorry, is that 3.75 or 3.74?
Yes, that was correct. Yes,
75. Yes, they equally apply. It's just that it's specific to as I said earlier, that allocation, but you would other policy would guide you to get to that conclusion anyway, that you needed to make those make that assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gunn. Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. And can I just say a 45% target of affordable housing in paragraph 28 seems a big step forward. It can be achieved. Is paragraph 28 one? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Paragraph 12 on page 9. Can I just check that the words has is after 45% on the fourth line of that paragraph? Do they mean have been or has been, or does it mean is being, or does it mean something else?
Thank you for spotting that. I can clarify. It means it is introduced. So it is introduced through the modifications.
Okay, well, that's fine. Can I just pick up some points in relation to Axby and Wigginton, policies SS11 and actually SS12 as well? These are probably very minor details, and I apologise for that.
Do you have a page number in?
Pardon? Page numbers 53 and 54 and part of 55 as well.
Thank you.
Paragraph modification reference MM 3.32, the fourth down on page 53, has been deleted because the matters concerned are addressed in the policy H3 and other design and placemaking policy, including D1. Okay. Can you just confirm that what is in H3 and D1 absolutely correspond with the words be of a high design standard, which will provide an appropriate new extension and deliver a sustainable housing mix, blah, 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 addressing local need for smaller family homes and bungalow/sheltered housing?
With regards the design principle. That those precise words are reflected in policy D1, because policy D1 covers design principles for every single development eventuality. But what it does do is draw out high-level design principles that should be embedded across different developments, and in effect drives that high standard of design. It articulates it in a much more detailed way, and therefore we felt it was unnecessary to repeat something like that. And actually that was endorsed by the inspectors as well. And similarly, the housing mix, that's the second provision there, policy H3 as amended refers to the local housing needs assessment as the evidence base, and making sure that those needs are reflected across the city, but also locally as well. So there's a general, you'll have seen across the board of all the strategic sites, we've taken out that housing mix policy again to avoid repetition and duplication.
I understand that, thank you. I appreciate the explanation. If you look at MM 3.38, policy SS 12, housing mix criterion is subtly different.
Yeah.
And I mean, the explanation talks about H10 and omits D1. So I'm just wondering, have you adopted a consistent policy towards these replacement of these offending paragraphs or part paragraphs?
There are some subtle differences, but we looked at them individually. Right, and in the case of the Haxby site, I did discuss with housing colleagues whether or not we could draw on enough evidence to be able to retain such a quite a specific ask in this regard, which was more specific than the general policy, which is policy H3, and it was felt we didn't have sufficient evidence to direct that precisely. It doesn't mean it can't come forward, but all of these policies have to be justified, and there has to be sufficient evidence to be able to sustain.
Well, my justification for asserting along the lines that you've just described would be that immediately on the opposite side of Usher Lane to the proposed new development is what might be termed a well-designed development in terms of Swarthdale and Usher Park Road and some cul-de-sacs off. I'm just thinking that, you know, having a lower standard of housing with a patently lower standard of design on one side of the road wouldn't necessarily endear it to people coming into or leaving Haxby. The raised eyebrows are a question mark.
I'm not entirely clear on what the question is.
The contrast in the potential design standard and the housing mix achieved on one that's already been achieved in Usher Park Road and Swarthdale versus what might be achieved on the other side of the road within 100 metres.
I think that the policy principle would still apply equally, and would be able to inform what comes forward on the site. And it's not necessarily a case that application of existing context and character should be carried forward just because it's there. There are opportunities to push higher through the design policy that we've got.
I'm sure local councils will be delighted to support the council in achieving that objective. Let me then go back to a policy that's in the land to the west of Wigginton Road, and it relates to provision of combined nursery and primary education facilities, 3.39. Sorry, 54, bottom of 54. Yet, and my reason for raising that is that that actually is not present in terms of the land to the north of Haxby. I appreciate that one proposed development is half the size of the other, but there will certainly be a need for primary education places. There may not be need for nursery, but there certainly will also be need in the fullness of time for secondary education places, which are not addressed in this. And it may be dealt with elsewhere and it may not be being modified.
Quite that point, yes.
Okay.
It's not, I'm just double checking, but the schedule that we're looking at here only deals with areas where we're changing things. And if a particular provision isn't being modified, it doesn't.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to look through the other 800 or whatever pages of the document. And lastly, again on page 54, second one down, MM 3.35 talks about the transport and highway impacts of the development should be assessed individually and cumulatively with sites ST 7, 8, 14 and 15. All of these are some significant distance away from ST 9 in this context, but similar provision I think is shown elsewhere. And the reason I'm asking the question is that's quite a wide area to have, if you like, a set of closely related transport provisions.
Here, what it's asking is that the developer makes sure that, given the size of those other sites that are referred to, that the transport impacts and highway impacts are looked at as a whole and holistically, and not in tight isolation to Haxby, because of the sheer scale of things. And just to confirm, the education requirement is within the policy at provision 5.
Well done, thank you. And one final point, if I may, on page 53, policy MM 333 talks about creation of a new open space to the south of the site in question. And it also talks about what may or may not be included in that space. And I realise that you've specified that the open space needs should be assessed in detail, in particular by liaison between the town and the parish council. But there is one of those possible inclusions listed in the sentence before that, which is space for a cemetery. Unusually, cemetery space is an expanding requirement, possibly because of COVID, but certainly in spite of it as well. And I'm just wondering whether there's a provision to actually include that as a formal requirement for this neck of the woods.
There isn't, and we made the amendment, or proposing the amendment, which is that we use the word may include, because we didn't have, and we don't have the evidence to again justify that that we can be sure that that's a specific requirement of that development, and again we had to justify the policy approach, and it was felt that by doing what we've done, we still retain the ability to achieve it, but there's more flexibility there that works on the council's side as well as the developer side.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Councillor Pavlovic, I was coming to you already and then you waved again. So I've actually got, by my calculation, 2 things that you wanted to say. Is that correct? Or is there more?
I can fill more than 2. Even though you did say you want to be out by 7, sorry. Holiday lets. Holiday lets, you've referenced them in this report, and I'm a little bit surprised, pleased but surprised, but there is no reference to it in the balancing the housing market policies in the draft plan. And I'm just wondering, given that we've had a full council motion on it, given that we've done an evidence base for the consultation process, why we're not incorporating something in respect of holiday lets. And you've made reference to what we could look at, such as main residence only conditions, restrictions on short-term lets. on new developments, why that's not been incorporated in, because it's not an SPD, it's going to require a policy change, and now is the time to be doing it. If you're going to be doing it, now's the time to do it, not after the plan's been adopted and waiting for a review period.
I'm not sure that we do have the evidence to make that policy change at the moment.
Well, the housing officers did prepare an evidence base for their consultation response about the extent of the sector, particularly across the city, but certainly in respect of the city centre, the Guildhall and Micklegate wards, which I think hold about 83% of all the short-term lets, which were now up to 2,500, and it's been a significant increase in the past 3 years. So I do think that you've got a window of opportunity here, Laura, that it's worth talking to the housing officers, because they did make some really significant submissions to government for the levelling up bill, is to now draft that into a policy modification to go out for consultation, because I think it will be incredibly popular, not least.
It probably would be popular, but I think in advance of the government making the changes and the legislative changes coming forward that we need, my professional opinion is we don't have any teeth to really latch on to be able to credibly make a policy change that would deal with the specific problems.
Can I just query that with you? Yes, we can't go back. We can't go back in time, but we certainly can for new developments, and whether there should be a requirement that certainly for new developments of a certain size, such as York Central, for example, which I think everybody fears will become Airbnb Central, that main residence requirements are something that we can write into policy. Tell me why we can't, for a start, and then whether it's advisable to do it is a different question.
Well, what would the policy say that we could? What can we control through planning policy?
A main residence requirement. You've referenced it here. Consider bringing forward options for Section 106 planning conditions that include but are not restricted to exclusivity sales periods for York residents on new build developments, and 2, main residence only conditions restricted on short-term lets on new developments. So you've referenced it. All I'm doing is saying, why not put that in now rather than wait for the plan to be adopted and then look at it later? Do you want to mull on it and get back to me?
Well, I think my view would be that a policy position wouldn't preclude you from, or preclude officers in determining applications from doing those things that you've helpfully read out.
It would preclude them from it. Because we have nothing. Sorry. It would preclude them from doing it because there will be nothing tangible in the plan, in our development plan, that says that's what we want and that's what we need.
In terms of moving things forward again, shall I add this?
Do you want to have
shall I add this to the one
about
regarding
it?
SPDs and ask for an update to be brought to executive regarding
When it comes
what the options
to you in a few
in
weeks.
terms of bringing that further forward?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. then my final question, I promise it is my final question, is around the HMOs.
Are you sure? Because he said it was final question and he asked another two. Is it a Cuthbertson final question or an actual final question?
Well, it's can you rely on my word? And I'm a politician that you can rely on. That's true. So HMOs, you know, we had a full council motion on it. There is an SPD already. Why can that SPD not be amended relatively quickly to incorporate things such as removing permitted development rights from C4 use classification properties?
So just in terms of the full council resolution, that was dealt with by executive last May. So the full council resolution references have been dealt with. What the proposals in the report are that we need to gather the evidence base to demonstrate that is proportionate. Because we've got to reflect that the current council's policy in respect to HMOs is not to stop HMOs being built across converged across the city. Effectively, that covers the whole city, does the Article 4 area. The concept of the neighbourhood and street level requirements in terms of percentage is the intention is to disperse HMOs across the cities. And what we've seen in there, therefore, in that regard, is actually we've got some areas of the city where, particularly in the wards where we've chosen to introduce, or executive has chosen to introduce the licensing policy for HMOs, considerable pressure in those areas, but there isn't a general, over the whole citywide perspective, an impact in respect of HMOs that we've got the evidence base for at this point in time that would suggest that we need to change the HMO policy. But what we've got in respect of both the decision by executive in May and the proposals that we've just talked about in terms of the holiday lets is that we look to provide that evidence base or consider what the evidence base actually is out there, so effectively members can take informed decisions on both of those aspects, reflecting that the overall housing numbers of the city will be getting on for 120,000 homes by the time we get to in the context of this plan. So what we're looking at is in terms of housing needs and the provision thereof, that has an impact in that overall context. And what you've got in respect to the HMO policy at the moment is to ensure that you don't have an intense area of impact in a specific area of the city, but there is a huge amount of capacity if you look at that overall city plan for more HMOs across the city. So there is a question as to the general removal of permitted development across the whole city as being proportionate to the impact. So we've got to actually get the evidence base, and that was a huge part of the local plan public inquiry process. There's a lot of things that people believe to be popular, as it were, or are appropriate from a perspective of an individual's understanding, but what we don't have is the broader evidence base to support a policy for a whole city. And that's what we're trying to bring forward in terms of both of these areas. Is members have expressed their concerns. We're effectively proposing that we take forward as far as we can the gathering of that evidence, but ultimately the evidence may not be there, or it may. We have to wait and see what the actual facts on the ground, how they manifest themselves in the reports to executive when they come forward.
Happy to go back to you, Councillor Pavlo. Your
not
entire,
your entire
reputation is on the line.
No, it's not a question. It's an observation and a response. And a response. Therefore, I stand by my original comments. Article 4s, as you know, are very rarely citywide, but in areas where there is a need for them, they can be a very useful tool. And in the wards around the university, around the academic areas, and I look at Councillor de Gaulle as well, who I have spoken to about this issue, the extension of use of permitted development of small HMOs to larger HMOs does have a major impact. Moving up from 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 actually does have an impact, and it would make a difference. But I'll leave it there.
Doesn't need a response.
It wasn't a question.
Okay, I have nobody else indicating that they want to have any questions or comments or any sing a song or anything. Tell poetry, councillor. Oh, good. No. Okay, at that point. So we have the recommendations on page 5, paragraph 2, 1, little 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 through to page 6. With the addition of an update to executive regarding potential for the cultural SPD and the one that I've now forgotten, the Airbnb issue. Are we happy to agree those recommendations? General no, I don't want to show that. General comments. Okay. With that, I have no urgent business. So thank everyone for their time and declare the meeting closed.